Will Tehran and Washington head toward reconciliation or confrontation? Diplomacy or war? It could go either way. The first step begins this Saturday as Iran and the United States are set to enter talks in Oman. And in a dramatic shift, officials from the Islamic Republic are now, for the first time, publicly threatening to move their enriched uranium to secure locations and expelling the UN nuclear inspectors. And in the White House, Trump appears to be doubling down on the potential to use force against Iran.
If it requires military, we're going to have military. Israel will obviously be very much involved in that. He'll be the leader of that. But nobody leads us. We do what we want to do.
To help us unpack this high-stakes moment, we've assembled a powerhouse panel for today's Eye for Iran. Gabriel Noronha, who served as special advisor for the Iran Action Group at the U.S. State Department under President Trump's first administration. Arash Azizi, Iran analyst, writer, and author of What Iranians Want. Jay Solomon, investigative reporter with the Free Press. And Behnam Taleblu, senior director of the Iran program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the FDD.
This isn't really a negotiation. This is a meeting to see whether Iran is remotely serious about a negotiation.
If we can force the Islamic Republic to give up on A, its nuclear program, B, some of its aggressive sort of regional behavior, why not? That's an alternative to wanting to enter a war.
Pushing away from the table, that would be exactly my personal and professional recommendation to the Trump administration.
See these tensions inside the Trump administration between kind of these hawkish, almost traditional conservative Republicans like Waltz, but then you have this wing of the MAGA movement, I guess most publicly with Tucker Carlson, but even J.D. Vance himself, they seem very reticent about military engagements, military strikes.
I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Welcome to the panel, everyone.
Good to be here.
Thanks
Good to be here.
Wonderful. There's a lot to cover, so let's dive right in. The U.S. says there will be direct talks. Iran says there will be indirect talk. So what's on the table, and does that difference of direct and indirect actually mean anything? Gabriel, let's begin with you. Based on your experience with the Trump administration and knowing President Donald Trump, what might President Trump be thinking as the two sides prepare to talk? Do you think he sees this as some sort of genuine opening, or is this more likely to be part of a broader pressure campaign?
Well, thanks for having me. No, I don't think he will propose a lighter, weaker version of the JCPOA. That's much more a Biden tactic. Trump does not believe in that. And, you know, at the end of the day, this isn't really a negotiation. This is a meeting to see whether Iran is remotely serious about a negotiation. And so this is really President Trump saying that there's one last way out for Iran to avoid the disastrous fate which it has put itself into. You know, President Trump, I don't think, would have tolerated the last 4 years of behavior. And so he's sort of been airdropped into the situation where Iran has gone way further than he ever would have permitted if he had been here the whole time. And so now it's sort of him saying there's an easy way out of this predicament, or there's the hard way out being military strikes. And Trump wants to give Iran that option, that way out of this. And again, so it's not really this, you know, it's not so much a, oh, we can talk for 5 months, you can talk for 5 months. It's much more a, are they interested in getting rid of their nuclear program, or are they not interested? And if they're not interested, that's okay. Negotiations don't have to happen, but it's an offer on the table for Iran.
And Arash, your take, how do you see Iran's position as they walk into that room? And do they have any strategy here, any leverage potentially?
Look, I think Gabriel is right in that the alternative to the talk, the alternative to a successful talks, let's say, right? The result of a failure of the talks is no longer, oh, there will be a lot more sanctions, you have to deal with it economically, you can grind through our military strikes and an escalation that could be really devastating to Iran as a nation. You know, and I think there are many people in Tehran, in the decision-making, the upper sort of echelons of the Islamic Republic, that don't want that they know that could be really lethal to them, they, you know, and to the Iran, to, you know, in a broader sense. So I think they are very motivated, as real estate agents say, right? They're very motivated to get a deal, and I think that there is a reasonable deal that could be made on the nuclear program and on the regional affairs. I think so. The reason for the alternative being so much worse means that while there are many hurdles to get there, a deal is entirely possible, and there is a seriousness in Iran that you can see. You can see different sort of centers of power in Iran have come to a consensus on the issue of that the talks are serious. Khamenei just a couple months ago was saying no talks to the U.S. And one last thing I'd say very briefly: this whole direct indirect, Iran is just saying the indirect stuff to save face. It's a sort of a pathetic. When you talk to people in Tehran, I talk to people in Tehran. They say, of course, it's going to be direct. I mean, they're going to talk. They're there, and they're going to be in the same room. But they're gonna, like, by indirect they mean, oh, the Omani prime minister is also there. But it's not indirect, in the way that Hamas-Israel talks are indirect, like in Cairo, and they're like in different sides. So these are basically direct talks.
So that's a significant development on its own. And we recently heard from Democratic U.S. Senator John Fetterman, who said he opposes any potential nuclear talks, with Tehran stating, quote, "I'm unsure of the value in negotiating. I would rather just have them destroy Iran's nuclear facilities." And now we've recently heard Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's obviously known as an Iran hawk traditionally, and would say things like, you can't ever trust Iran, you can't talk to Iran. Now suddenly he's saying he's optimistic about talks and that this could lead to peace. Behnam, you helped craft the Maximum Support Act to give tangible backing to the Iranian people under maximum pressure. How would you respond to Fetterman's remarks as well as Marco Rubio? And does that give us a broader sense of the mood in Congress and that of Secretary of State Marco Rubio as well, please?
Well, it's a great question. There's certainly rhetoric and then there's reality. Let me just tell you, pushing away from the table, that would be exactly my personal and professional recommendation to the Trump administration, which is push away from the table. 2025 certainly indeed is a year of decision on Iran's nuclear program. There's no doubt about that. But to actually rush into negotiations and actually express this overt desire for some kind of a pause or a reset would actually risk playing into the Islamic Republic's hands. And certainly the president knows that he created a successful policy called maximum pressure back between 2018 and 2020. And Biden, unfortunately, former President Biden, had 4 years to really undo the net effects of that, leading to the massive escalation in the region, leading to the massive accumulation that we've seen in terms of Iranian both nuclear capacity and capability that now the president is forced to have to roll back and get creative about. So I think, one, with respect to the main pillar of the president's main strategy towards Iran, which is maximum pressure, those sanctions need a little bit more time. At the same time, to make any kind of negotiation, which again, we have to be honest, this is a president who, even when he was a candidate prior to term one, was talking a lot about, I buy bad deals, I turn them into good deals. So if the president nonetheless is keen on some kind of a negotiated or diplomatic solution, that may not be my preference first as an Iranian American looking to level on, maximum support with maximum pressure. But if the president first, indeed, genuinely, as Gabe was saying, wants to give diplomacy a chance, the best way to do that is to make sure that Iran doesn't have credible exit options, meaning Iran's option away from the table should not be better for the regime or should not be more effective for the regime than the option to come to the table. And that, I think, is where, both max pressure and a credible military option, as well as that final element that you asked, which is maximum support, can really do a lot to shape Iranian thinking about. What's quite clear for a long time now under Democratic and Republican administrations in Washington is that Washington really hasn't had a ground game towards Tehran, particularly when it comes to a ground game in terms of supporting the Iranian people. The desire to really get different political organizations and institutions and Iran watchers and policymakers and even lawmakers talking about supporting the Iranian people is that, well, the next time Iranian people come out into the street against their government is a matter of when, not if. And Washington cannot afford to be caught flat-footed again with respect to that proposition, deal or no deal.
And would Behnam talks then between the U.S. and Iran jeopardize that in any way in terms of maximum support? How does that fit into the narrative here?
Well, I think deal or no deal, maximum support is both something in theory and practice that needs to be incorporated in terms of Washington's Iran policy. Now, I, for one, am in favor of having your Iran policy be congruent and axiomatic rather than disjointed in setting itself back. So yes, I believe that if you do have these high-level talks right now, it would actually set back the even idea of maximum support. And again, just comparing the president to his own record, look at the 2025 Nowruz address by the president on the White House website and compare that to really the beginning of max pressure back in 2018. And it leaves a lot more to be left for desired in the realm of supporting the Iranian people.
Now, of course, we know President Trump sent a letter to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, offering to negotiate or else all options are on the table. Jay, you had a report recently for the Free Press where you were briefed by some Trump officials on the content of that letter. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And what have you learned? And also, what have you learned about some of the potential internal tensions among Trump's team influencing this moment? What do you know?
I mean, the Trump letter is interesting because the people I talked to in the administration were, Trump was really involved in sort of editing the final draft. He was very much involved.
Wow.
So you could see, it's a big issue for him, and I think a lot of it, what's in it, is now pretty clear. Offering, direct talks. We don't want conflict, but kind of setting this 2-month time frame to test whether these guys are serious, and if they're not, this line of all hell to pay, which is what the White House spokeswoman said on Tuesday. So I think I think this weekend in Oman, when Witkoff meets with the Iranian foreign minister, Iranchi will sort of set this clock moving until, I guess mid-May, basically, late May. I guess what's still kind of confusing is the person who's negotiating it is Steve Witkoff. And his positions, at least publicly, of what a deal would look like is a lot different than what Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, he's talked about essentially dismantling the whole program. The Libya model, people describe it, which is when the U.S. actually went into Libya in the early 2000s and took out all of the equipment and moved it to Tennessee. That's how Waltz is describing it. Witkoff is describing it in a much less kind of draconian way. And I think what some people have been a little confused about with Witkoff, the one kind of platform he's gone out to really discuss his diplomacy in recent weeks was on Tucker Carlson. And Carlson himself has almost daily been lobbying very publicly against any military strikes on Iran, as it would be disastrous for the country. So you can see these tensions inside the Trump administration between kind of these hawkish, almost traditional conservative Republicans like Waltz, but then you have this wing of the MAGA movement, I guess most publicly with Tucker Carlson, but even J.D. Vance himself. They seem very reticent about military engagements, military strikes, and how is this kind of tension going to play out if the Iranians, I think, as Behnam says, do they kind of dangle some diplomacy that we know is probably just going to end in kind of endless months of diplomacy? But is that enough for someone like Witkoff to say, let's take this? We don't want conflict. We don't want to see, while the financial markets in the world are whipsawing, we don't want to see oil markets spiking. Do they kind of cling to this thing or jump on board because it seems politically maybe the best thing to do?
You talked about tensions. You talked about Mike Waltz. What about Secretary of State Marco Rubio? Have you heard anything about him?
I mean, traditionally, I think he was a lot like Waltz. I think some people are just trying to read the president and where he is on this and kind of, step back. I think no one wants to get crosswise with the president. It does seem like they're kind of knives out for Waltz in some ways. There were a lot of national security, at least 4 officials who got fired last week, some of them had worked for Waltz, and it feels like his power is being clipped. So it is interesting that this negotiation is going to be led with Witkoff, who is not in the cabinet. He seems, he's very, very close to Trump, and that's his power. But he also feels like he could be a bit of a freelancer, or his politics might be different than others in the cabinet.
It's really interesting you brought up Steve Witkoff. Of course, he's a special envoy in the Middle East for President Trump, taking the lead on these negotiations, as you said. And he recently deleted a post on X where he was responding to a post by Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, where he was declaring that the country only seeks peaceful nuclear energy. And he responded with great, and then later erased it. I wanted to get everyone's reaction to that and how it relates to the negotiations. If we could start with you, Gabriel, then Arash, Jay, and Behnam, again, on your reaction to that, what he potentially meant by that, and does it impact the negotiations or the talks that we're about to see, I should say?
Well, I'm always of the view that if you delete something, it means you didn't mean to say it necessarily. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt that perhaps as a boomer, he may have meant to send that to someone instead of responding to it. That being said, the United States in the first Trump administration made the case that Iran could possibly have peaceful nuclear energy because that doesn't necessarily require domestic enrichment. The United Arab Emirates has this 123 agreement with the United States where it does not have any uranium enrichment, but it has nuclear power generation. Iran has the Bushehr nuclear reactors. Those could, in theory, generate power without any domestic enrichment. That is something that, again, if Iran is behaving well, could be a very powerful carrot the United States offers to Iran, as well as perhaps even other benefits, tangential benefits of nuclear industry that would otherwise be withheld from Iran.
Yeah, so look, I think he was genuine. I think, and it's because it's not just a tweet, great, right? It's his talk with Tucker Carlson that Jay mentioned. Is everything else he has said? It's how J.D. Vance talks about the issue. Is how President Trump talks about it. President Trump has talked about this issue in a consistent way, right? What else you want to say about him for over the many years? It's not like this is something that he's zigzagged on. It's pretty clear. It's a pretty consistent and rational position. They said, look, if we can force the Islamic Republic to give up on A, its nuclear program, B, some of its aggressive sort of regional behavior, why not? That's an alternative to wanting to enter a war. Wanting to, and the thing about, you said, oh, there's Iran hawks like John Fetterman say, oh, wouldn't it be great if we can just take it out? Yes, if you could press a button and the nuclear program would go away, a lot of people would do it. Ehud Barak, perhaps the most decorated Israeli military officer, wrote an article in Time a few years ago to explain just some of the reasons why military strikes would have a very difficult way. And I'm not saying, Israeli military sort of innovation is always impressive. They might come up with new ways, like they're possible, obviously, so that option is always there, and I think Iran should take it seriously. But obviously, if there's a way to get it done with diplomacy, they would prefer it. So I think someone like Witkoff, listens to stuff like, and this is the last thing I'd say, listens to stuff like, you can't trust Iran. But it's not a matter of trusting, it has never been a matter of trusting, right? It's not, you can't trust North Korea, you can't trust Libya, you can't trust a lot of these people. It's about, verification, right? And is there a possible way to verify so that you can keep Iran away from the nuclear weapons? Of course there is. There is a verification regime that has worked in Iran, that has worked in other countries. So I think it shows a very good faith action by Witkoff, who doesn't approve of the ideology or the kind of people that Arakchi and the Islamic Republic are, but does want to work with them and get to an agreement on this issue.
I thought the interesting thing about the Witkoff was the question was, did he think he was direct messaging him? Like, was that a DM? And I think that...
I was wondering that too.
Yeah, that raises a question, and this is kind of always the case with Iran and diplomacy. Like, are there a lot of other channels that are being used that we don't know of? Has Witkoff been directly communicating with Iranchi for a while? There was talk early on that Musk had met with the Iranian ambassador. Elon Musk had met with the Iranian ambassador in at the United Nations. And if you remember the last go around during the Obama administration, when it turned out there had been secret talks going on for 6-12 months before it became public. So when I saw that, the question I had was Iranchi and were they Witkoff already sort of communicating already? I think a lot of people thought that.
Yeah, I think Jay really hit the nail on the head. Not much to add there, other than, of course, how much of this was designed to be covert versus overt. I remember this phrase going around back in 2013, Twitter diplomacy, when Zarif, Iran's then foreign minister, was trying to basically inject Iranian factionalism into U.S. domestic debates over how to deal with Iran. So I don't know if Special Envoy Witkoff's deleted great comment was either a boomer mistake, as Gabe said, or perhaps, as Jay mentioned, a DM or a direct message. But it did remind me very much of kind of the overt versus covert dynamics we've seen, because U.S.-Iran diplomacy, as odd as it is to say, given that these two countries don't have formal diplomatic relations, is actually not an aberration in the past 46 years. There's covert, there's overt, there's direct, there's indirect. They've negotiated over arms, hostages, even regional security, more recently fissile material, frozen assets. There's been a lot of diverse contact. And yes, there's certainly mistrust, but don't take it from me, take it from Zarif. Even something like the JCPOA was not built on trust. So here, perhaps moving forward, one is reminded of that famous Iranian phrase, which is not about negotiation, but about how you can say what you want, which is to push away with the hand, to pull towards you with the foot, or ba dast mizanan aqab, ba pa mikishan jalo. So, maybe the Iranians are sensing that, yeah, they can be a coy a little bit here, because the U.S., whether on Twitter or whether from the State Department spokesperson or whether from other U.S. officials, loud and clear, are trying to or is trying to seek some kind of a diplomatic option, and so they can afford to kind of raise the asking price here. And that's always been the ultimate fear, because the escalation did not happen on Trump's watch, at least in terms of the capacity. It happened under President Biden, and now we're really left with this crisis that is barreling towards us, where the two extremes, both a bad deal or a needlessly elongated military conflict, are kind of quite highly likely barreling towards us.
Behnam, I wanted to ask you about the uranium threat. Iranian officials are now saying that they may transfer enriched uranium to secret locations, that they may block off, the IAEA inspections. What does that really mean? I haven't heard this being said publicly before. How significant is this move in the context of nuclear escalation as we head into talks?
Well, it's very significant because, particularly with the collapse of the more traditional elements of Iran's deterrence apparatus, Iran is really putting all its eggs in the nuclear basket. You've seen that over the past few years, even the change in the discourse from semi-official Iranian media outlets, official Iranian media outlets, Iranian officials, current and past, talking about the ease with which they could make a nuclear weapon, the speed with which they could create a nuclear weapon, the utility of having a nuclear weapon. I mean, this is not cheap talk or domestic bluster. This is designed to fill the gap of the collapse of their deterrent architecture. And Iran is really creating what you can call like a what is that thing, that the sand that drips, the timetable, the an hourglass. They have an hourglass strategy where at the top it's nuclear escalation, getting bigger, and at the bottom it's diminished monitoring and verification. And if they really do diminish that monitoring and verification to zero, then they're raising the risk of America continuing a pressure policy, because we'd be continuing that pressure policy blind. And if there is what you said at the end there, which is technically called diversion from a declared facility to an undeclared facility, it would mean that we would be entirely reliant on national technical means or signals intelligence or local human sources, where in the event of trying to stop an Iranian nuclear breakout, you would have to hit known as well as unknown sites. And that was always the way the U.S. accidentally stumbled into Iraq. It wasn't, some just Bush administration phenomenon. It was really since the late 90s, with the diminishment of this monitoring, the debate over what is where and how much of it is there became as much a political debate as a policy debate and an intelligence debate. And ironically, by Iran raising that, the regime may actually expedite that which it's trying to deter, which is a military conflict, because it is high risk, high reward, both for Washington and Tehran when it comes to that kind of stuff.
And I have a broader question for everyone. And Gabriel, I'll start with you, because I know you have to leave soon and you've got a hard out. More sanctions versus submission to the United States. Given Iran's increasingly fragile economy and geopolitical standing, which path is potentially less viable, more viable for the regime in your view? And then we'll get to everyone else after.
Well, the Iranian government likes to say that they have experts in they have a PhD in sanctions busting. And it's true, they've learned a lot. They've developed a lot of resiliency against sanctions. But partly it's almost like an antibiotic. They're used to being able to deal with a certain viral load. But if you have a massive load of sanctions coming in and you really go aggressive, then it changes the ability for the system to really bypass sanctions. And so I think that not only have the Iranians learned, but the United States has also learned as well. And what's happened in the past couple months is very aggressive sanctions enforcement. We've already seen, I think just today, we just had another large, massive tranche of sanctions going after China in particular, as well as this ghost fleet of tankers. And so I think Iran is going to find that over time, the pressure is going to build and build and build, and the tactics the United States can bring to bear are going to be more and more advanced to really strangle that off. And Iran has to ask the question. It could withstand 18 months of maximum pressure back in 2019 and 2020. Can it withstand 4 years of sustained maximum pressure? Is it willing to? What are the consequences to its economy and its ability to fund its proxies or even domestic priorities? And I think they're going to really, really struggle there. One thing that's really important to note is that the Biden administration, when they wanted negotiations, ceased all economic sanctions, ceased all enforcement. Here we have had, I think, 6 rounds of sanctions now against Iran. Even today, on the eve of negotiations, those are continuing. It's sending a message that the United States won't give sanctions for talks. It will give sanctions if there's an agreement and not the other way around. So the game is very different here. I think Iran will struggle a lot more than they think that they might do. And I apologize for my premature departure on
Oh,
this.
no,
Thank
no,
you.
and we appreciate you being here. Thank you so much, Gabriel. Arash, Jay, and Behnam, I'd love to get your thoughts on that topic of submission versus sanctions. Which is worse for the government of Iran?
Look, depends who are we talking about. Sort of, I think the Iranian regime is not united. I think Ayatollah Khamenei, towards sort of the end of his life, he's not a fighter, unlike what he likes to pretend. He's like a contradiction of his life. He has his revolutionary ideology. He wants to destroy Israel. He wants to fight the United States. But he's basically a bit of a coward, frankly, and he's not one to take fights in. So I think he's pressured by a lot of people. But I think a lot of people, in fact, I would dare say, a good, very significant, even past majority section of the Iranian establishment, they don't want to follow Khamenei's policies forever. They know that it has brought for Iran nothing but destruction and isolation. So they want to pursue different policies towards the world that would bring better economic prosperity for people. And I think they realize how much hated they are by their own population. They realize that they've only stayed in power by blood and by repression and by killing their own people. And I think if they find an economic way so that they could, Iran could do it a little better, they'll prefer that. But as for Khamenei and sort of the hardliners, I think they'll happily sort of, in a broader scheme of things, they'll destroy Iran before they give up on their, on their sort of agendas. But the good news is they're politically weakened, and Khamenei will turn 86 next week, and I hope he dies soon. Every day that he dies sooner is better for Iran. I'm not sure if it is allowed to say on TV or not, but every day that he dies sooner, I believe it's better for Iran, and I think he will not have a successor. I think his line will not be continued in the future. So a bit of a turnaround answer there, but I hope
No, that's very interesting. Before we get to Jay and Behnam, when the Supreme Leader does pass away, which is everybody has a day, and he is turning 86 next week, as you mentioned, and you said he doesn't have a successor, what's going to happen to Iran then? Is it going to become more militarized? What way is it going to go, potentially?
I think, I don't have a crystal ball as much as anybody else, but I think the most likely outcome is that Iran will have to relax its domestic sort of social repression, not political repression, i.e. will not become a democracy. We'll have to relax social repression domestically, and it would have to give up on these stupid anti-Israel, anti-American policies and become a more normal sort of Middle Eastern state. I think that's written on the wall. And of course, the struggles of Iranian women, youth, workers for democracy, for social justice will continue. But Iran's sort of economic isolation and what has really come to bring our nation to the brink of destruction for these sort of Islamist obsessions of one man and his coterie, I think that will end. I have some optimism that and that will end. Although there's always other scenarios that are possible.
So much is riding on the Supreme Leader then.
Sorry.
So much is
exactly.
riding on the Supreme Leader then.
I think so, and I think that the fact that, look, we have to all think about this question: why did Khamenei sort of agree to these talks when until 2 months ago he didn't just say he won't enter the talks? He said talking to the U.S. is unwise, dishonorable, and irrational. Right? 2 months ago, not 20 years ago. Right? and he's now been forced to do it. And if you look at, this is the last thing I'd say, look at the tweet, another deleted tweet, more important than Witkoff tweet, by Hesam Ashna. This isn't some like rando. This is one of the highest sort of intelligence hands in Iran. And he tweeted, and he's being prosecuted for it now. He did this impassioned tweet quite clearly to Khamenei, although he didn't name him. And he basically said, you're destroying this country because you want to keep power for you and your sons. So there is, this is a Samedin Ashera. This isn't a regime opponent like me, from the United States talking. So I think a lot of people inside Iran are angry at Khamenei's policies, and they realize that if Iran wants to not be destroyed as a nation state, it needs to put them aside. And I think that's the future.
I think on the sanctions front, one of the interesting tensions, it's definitely the case that Iran is hurting financially. The U.S. is squeezing even higher. But Khamenei or the hardliners might be thinking, look, the U.S. and China are in a massive trade war. The Chinese are definitely not going to be doing anything to help the U.S. as far as pressuring Iran. So maybe we can just, keep selling oil to China. We can get through this. But that also puts Iran so much more squarely in the Chinese and Russian camp. Is that where they really want to be? I thought one of the interesting things in the last couple of days, Foreign Minister Aranchi wrote an opinion piece in the Washington Post where he clearly is kind of reaching out to the Witkoff Trump world's view of wow, we can do business with these guys. It's Aranchi wrote about unlocking this $1 trillion economy. So he was definitely playing to that side of Trump's view that this deal could be as much about economics and trade it is about nuclear weapons. But I still get back to the question, would Khomeini really ever allow the U.S. to massively invest in Iran? He traditionally has said things that makes it seem like he sees that as a bigger threat than military strikes, opening up the economy and allowing a Trump Tower in Tehran. So is this just posturing by Aranchi ahead of these talks to sort of start scrambling the Trump team, or is there really a split where there are elements that, I think there are elements of Iran who would definitely like to do business with the United States for sure, but the number one, the supreme leader, traditionally has seen this as the biggest threat. That's why I'm pretty skeptical in a lot of ways what Aranchi wrote in the Post.
Can I just say one quick thing, in line of what Jay said, that so you're 100% right. This goes against everything Khamenei has stood for. He's always said, the real threat is U.S. cultural and economic influence. But President Pezeshkian, just a few days ago, said that according to Khamenei, right, Iran wants to welcome U.S. investors, right? And now, of course, this is how it works. Pezeshkian said that. I'm not even clear. Maybe he was freeballing. Maybe he misspoke. But then every other officials are saying, well, if if Pezeshkian says, and the other thing that I think we have to remember is that Iran, again, both as a nation and this includes some people in the establishment, is quite a Russo skeptic, right? This is our big bear. We're always afraid of it, and I think the regime even understands that the worst scenario for it, the worst nightmare for it, is that if it becomes a plaything between Trump and Putin, right? And because yes, Putin has had some good military ties with Iran. He has as good military ties and security ties. Well, maybe not as much, but as good ties with Israel, right? He said before that he considers Israel part of the Russian-speaking world, even, right? He's definitely not an anti-Israel guy. And so, regime could be easily sold down the river, and Iran could be sold down the river if it becomes. So I think, in line, I think with what Jay was also saying, they're very wary of not becoming a vassal of China or Russia, because it would be really not a nice fate for any nation.
And also to add to that, Arash, as well as a potential ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine could also impact all of that as well that you're mentioning.
That's right.
Yeah. Behnam, your thoughts?
There's a lot there to unpack. Maybe a little. We'll start a little bit from back, and if I miss anything or confuse anything, please, Negar, jump in and tell me. But beginning with the increasing, this new lingo, DC loves things that come in threes or fours, this axis of authoritarians or axis of aggressors or axis of revisionists or newfound axis of evil. Listen, I think that's more a product of agency than structure. The people making the structural argument that this is just U.S. pressure pulling these divergent historical powers together that harbor these historical grievances is frankly not true, because it's actually been the will and the official policy, kind of more covert, and then really since the Ahmadinejad era, overt, of really moving Iran into these camps. Iran is trying to move from, under the auspices of the Islamic Republic, junior partner to mid-level partner to the likes of Russia and China. I mean, the empirics tell a very interesting story. Even prior to the JCPOA, whether you look at pre-deal, during deal, post-deal, China is the largest licit and then later on illicit importer of Iranian crude oil. Russia is increasingly, not 100% in the past, but now increasingly becoming Iran's lawyer in so many international fora, where it's the Security Council or the IEA Board of Governors. They're showing that they have a real destructive power. Iran is an asset for these countries to be able to wield as their geopolitical competition with the West heats up. And one real detriment of the Islamist government in Iran, and this is really one of the shortcomings of not having a nationalist, let alone a representative government in that country that would really benefit from and be able to ride on that 500 years of mistrust and whatnot, is that these were choices to move closer to the Russians. Like, I can find you quotes from the 1990s that look like someone is parroting post-February 2022 Putin talking points, but they actually are coming from Iranian officials, people like Velayati, former foreign minister, now special advisor to Iran's supreme leader. So this tightening entente of adversaries, or this authoritarian axis, it's really about leader choices and establishment choices that has brought us to this point. And how that actually ties to sanctions is because, well, if it's not a product of structure, if it's not a product of sanctions, if it's a product of agency, then the role for the U.S. there actually is to first and foremost detect where there is a grievance and magnify it, and then to ultimately get these countries, if what Arash is saying is true, to sell the Islamic Republic out for the right price. I mean, the Obama administration was actually able to do that when it came to banking sanctions with the Chinese between 2010 and 2012. It doesn't mean you zero out Iranian oil, even though that is what the Trump administration has said it wants to do, but it wants to actually give the leverage over to the Chinese by doing what Gabe was mentioning, which is by increasingly coupling the Iran sanctions issue and the China larger economic issue. You can get the Chinese, who are quite mercantilist and ruthless in this sense, to actually decouple the Iran issue for you. I mean, just look at the Middle East, for example. In the past 20 years, you've had the Saudis go, 25 years, as quarter century, go from being a number one trade partner being the U.S. and number one trade partner being China. And in that world, they've actually been purchasing more crude oil from the Saudis than from the Iranians. And it's to actually be able to tap into this mercantilism that the Chinese have in the region, to be able to deny the regime of revenues so that you can actually be able to have a peaceful pressure policy without actually being able to have to fire a shot. Because an unintended war or an accidental war or a war that is poorly planned would be really the worst thing when it comes to that final element, especially the final element that Arash is talking about, which is not a population that'll just give in to a laxed social setting in a post-Khamenei Iran, but a population that can actually achieve what they've wanted for over a century, which is political representation, justice, economic justice, social justice. And that would really be a travesty, in my view, whether post-Khamenei Iran continues in a revolutionary Islamist direction, or if you have to have a kleptocratic Pakistan or a pre-1970s militarist South Korea-style model in Tehran tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So there's a lot more negativity in my comments there, but it is negativity from the prism, first and foremost, of A, the debate of structure versus agency, and B, being able to prioritize geopolitically and morally what we want and expect from Iran.
And let's turn our attention to what's actually happening inside Iran. Arash, I want to ask you, what is the reaction of everyday, ordinary Iranians to news of potential negotiations? And how is the media, the state media, portraying all of this in Iran?
This is a great question and has two parts that are quite different. So Iran is a country of 90 million, right? Three of us are here, right? Iranians, right? I'm sure we'll have different views if we get to talk about it, right? So I think if there's a mood I can detect, and I'd love to know what Behnam thinks, like regardless of our own opinions, right? I'm saying, what is the sort of mood in Tehran? I think the general mood is sort of exhaustion. People have, have their lives destroyed. They have their economy destroyed. Just imagine, since last year, right? The USD was trading for 600,000 riyals is now trading close to 1 million riyal. Although it did improve when the news of the talks came, it improved by 5%, which really shows you where things are going. And this is not just an abstraction. What would happen to any of us sitting here if our savings in our bank account was halved in the matter of 6 months, right? Now, for Iranians, this is basically what has happened throughout the last 20 years. Not to mention, of course, that tons of Iranians have fought and died fighting the regime. They were killed fighting the regime. So I think sort of exhaustion. I don't think they're very excited about potential of the talks as they were in 2014 or 2015. But I think some of them, probably me, I can speak to you as an Iranian. If it results in lessening of the sanctions, better ties, between the countries, a bit of breathing in Iranian sort of middle class, and allowing a bit of more relaxation, I consider it a positive thing. And I think so. There are some people who think like me in Iran, and there's some people who will think differently. The state TV is quite fascinating because the state TV is really controlled by an sort of extremist faction, and that's shown in the last 2 days. It's basically running hellfire against the talks, right? In fact, even though there's clearly a bit of coordination between different power factions in Iran, like the armed factions and the foreign ministry and others, they seem to all be more or less giving the same message. And the Kayhan newspaper, when it tried to sort of, say things against President Trump, in fact, sort of joke about his assassination, it was kind of reprimanded. But yet the state TV is like a free agent, which of course returns us exactly to the dynamics we saw in 2014, 2015. This is what we're going to see. The opponents of the talks, opponents of Iranian-American normalization, whether they are sort of Iranian hardliners, or those in Iran who are sort of devout fans of Khamenei, or those who are, for other reasons, opponents of the regime abroad. And I don't want to say morally equate them in any way, but they, there is an effective political front. They'll do everything to bring the talks down and speak against them. And that's the film. This is sort of the movie we saw in 2013 to 2015. And by the sound of it, this is exactly what we're going to see now. And the state TV clearly is on the side of the opponents. Although I think if it continues this way, state TV might get a reprimand at some point as well. It's it's led by this extremist sort of faction that I think is marginalized politically in Iran, actually. So I think they can't continue this line for as long as they did in 2013 to 15.
And Behnam, Arash was interested in your thoughts. So am I, and so is Jay in the audience, of course. So if you could you could give us your thoughts too.
Well, listen, also, I think that there's quite a bit there. I was thinking to myself as we were discussing comments from Arash in the previous question about the Pezeshkian kind of freestyling of Khamenei's comment about come and invest. I was debating this morning, and really I haven't had time today because everyone is still drinking from the fire hose of what will happen in Oman. Is it direct, indirect? Does style have a substance of its own or not here? To what degree exactly does the shape of the table, even borrowing from the Oslo and the 90s peace process stuff, even affect this stuff? I was thinking of tweeting Khamenei's or whatever, Xing or sending a message about Khamenei's between finalization day and implementation day comments about the JCPOA in 2015, where he was saying, we actually got this as a way to blunt American economic pressure. And he kind of goes on for a few sentences that this economic pressure, that this economic investment could be a front for cultural imperialism and political whatnot, and political influence that is undue or unwarranted and could be used to do a whole host of things. So it's interesting to compare Khamenei and to compare Khamenei against Khamenei. And there's certainly the ideological Khamenei, there's certainly the personal Khamenei, and then there's also the political Khamenei. And sometimes they match, and sometimes they're entirely like Picasso cubism and really all over the place. And Khamenei is someone who likes to hit the gas and the brakes at the same time. He reminds me actually very much of this comment that the last U.S. ambassador actually used about the Shah, which, whether you want to say was inappropriate or not, I think I see in spades when it comes to Khamenei. And I think the line, or the summary line, was like weakness in the face of strength, strength in the face of weakness. And it is eerily odd. It is so eerie how Khamenei could so willingly backtrack from something he said. Forget about my comment from 2015. Comments from 2 months ago that Arash just mentioned, and just taking that sudden shift and applying it to the debate in Washington where the primary look at the clergy is through like a calcified lens, through an ideological lens, where when you talk to the Iranian people who were born and raised there, people who have come more recently, people who are still there, who are kind of dealing with this situation, dealing with the Islamic Republic, when you ask for a view about the clergy, it's not an ideological or an ethical force. It's a highly opportunistic, highly corrupt force that actually is known for exactly these kind of idiosyncratic and non-axiomatic positions to say one thing and to do another. And Arash kind of alluded to the debate in Washington, the debate in Tehran. I think first and foremost, just looking at the debaters themselves, how the proponents of this kind of engagement have had to marry this policy, how the Trump administration will have to marry this policy with its own rhetoric, just as how the Islamic Republic of Iran officially, government-wise, is going to have to marry this policy with things it's said and with things it's done. So I think just on that level alone, and on the second front, the one that Arash mentioned about, these kind of naysayers on both sides, I'm glad he mentioned there's no moral equivalence, but I also think there's no political equivalence either, because we have to ask ourselves now, if we do see all this historical evidence for different kinds of U.S.-Iran touchpoints over the past 46 years, what has been the force keeping it transactional and not transformational? It's certainly been, in my view, the ideological side in Iran. It's not because the naysayers in D.C. have been so effective. It's really the ability of one side to pump the brakes and to not let something bleed over, just like so many in the American business community or whatnot would like to bleed over. When you look at Iran and the way they negotiate, it's very one-shot game. It's not like a theory of political economy. It's very much just about economics. How can you maximize and front-load something, go away from it? The regime, by embracing negotiations, is embracing a totally pragmatic tool so that it can continue its same ideological end. And I don't think you can say that about a lot of the naysayers of or the skeptics of U.S.-Iran diplomacy in Washington. At least there's that consistency there, I would say.
Can I just say something very quickly to that? I would say that, look, this is where I disagree with Behnam on some points, that he doesn't see, this view doesn't see the sort of ideological diversity in the Islamic Republic, right? I mean, and you don't need to...
I still say one of the most important issues, I say factionalism is less so a driver of Iranian foreign policy today than ever before in the past 46 years, but the one area in the foreign policy arena where it remains is certainly the nuclear issue.
Okay, so I by that, all I mean by that is that there have been and are very important elements of the Islamic Republic, who don't believe in Khamenei's ideology. I mean, they do believe Iran should have good ties with the United States and that they should flourish. They believe anti-Americanism and anti-Israelism is bullshit. Is excuse my language, is outdated, it's terrible, and again, you don't need to take my word for it. This is the stuff they say all the time. If you listen to the I know that you do listen, right? So I think this idea that because of the ideology they'll always break it misses the point that no, actually the approach to America from Iran since the 1980s, has always been one that has pitted different factions against each other, because Iran, the Islamic Republic, different proponents of it started understanding that this anti-Americanism is going nowhere in the mid-80s, and certainly by now they've come to that conclusion, because, and this is our important point, because you said about Islamism versus nationalism, right? I think because a lot of them are nationalists in some ways. I think they do think in terms of an Iran, and I think they know that the Khamenei's sort of ideology, Islamism that was in the 60s and the 70s, is dead, is not a serious force, and these people spend no time. They consider those like Jalili and all who push these ideas, they consider them sort of losers, and not serious people. And I think that's where the opportunity lies.
Super quick footnote, and we should bring in Jade, not to make this just a conversation about what sources, but just super quick footnote. I'm not going to get into the Islamism and nationalism. That would be a good podcast for a separate day. But the reason why, if I have hypothetically today or any day limited time, why I would prefer to read Vatan Emruz and Kayhan over Sharh or Etemad is not because they have better writing, because I think you know better than I, as your native Persian speaker born and raised there, that the writing is going to be atrocious compared to those two, or even the quality of the research. But the worldview that it encapsulates for you in those hardline Tehran dailies is closer to the worldview of those in power, and particularly those with their hands on the lever. The most important, I believe so, because those views about being able to moderate the Islamic Republic's behavior let alone moderate the Islamic Republic's rhetoric on Israel, have not been even able to make themselves apparent beyond the level of a domestic debate. I mean, I'm reminded of that 1990s PBS, I don't know, it was a Frontline or whatever documentary about the reformist press in Iran, red lines and deadlines. They have not been able to punch above their weight there, even in terms of messaging to the press. There's no doubt about the diversity. The doubt is about the impact of the diversity.
Arash and Jay, what do you guys think, both of you?
I'll let Jay go first.
Well, as a non-total Persian speaker,
You speak
Yeah,
a
I
little
mean,
bit of Farsi, a little bit.
I've heard
The
him.
right words.
I mean, I will just say I've always found as a journalist, following the Iranian press was always very interesting because sometimes there's sometimes stuff in there that was a lot more honest than what was in the Western press. I remember in particular this was during the Obama years when we found out there was the Obama administration had secretly shipped $1.7 billion in cash. It was actually being reported in the Persian press. So the Persian press can actually, even if it's highly ideological, I've always found it extremely useful because there's a lot of stuff being said and reported that's truthful and interesting.
So what I would say is that my disagreement with Behnam is that so interesting. He said the worldview of those in power is closer to Kayhan and then Sharq and Etemad. So I disagree, and one reason I disagree is that first of all there's a third option. So Sharq and Etemad are reformist. Kayhan and Batan Emruz are sort of hardliners, right? But there's a broader, bigger option, the centrist, right? I say Astra Iran, I say Entekhab, I say all these journals. And I think that actually encapsulates what a lot of people in the leadership think. I think Kayhan is a small minority, even in the establishment. And look, reasons for this are pretty simple, right? It's because it's a sort of a material analysis. The people with bread, as people who control sort of butter and guns in Iran, people who have economic interest and all that, there's no economic interest in wanting to follow this kind of anti-American policies that has isolated them. They send all their kids to Canada and Switzerland and Germany, right? And the United States if they could help it. They know there is no future in this kind of policies. So I don't think it's true that the sort of Kayhan gives you a good idea of what the average person in the National Security Council thinks. It is what Khamenei thinks and what his disciples think, but the future of Iran is not that of Khamenei. I think his life is a big failure because he understood this very well. In the 40th anniversary of the revolution, 2019, he said we need to develop a new generation of what he called young, devout youth that will continue the revolution. It looks like Behnam thinks he's been successful and that there are people in the regime
Why he's been successful in
but I
some
don't
way.
think he's been successful. I think if
Not by that measure, but I'll tell you why. Continue. But
I'll end with saying this. I don't think he's been successful because I think when you talk to these guys, you have someone like Qalibov. I've talked to the guy or other people in the establishment, the regime. Honestly, there's not an ounce of Islamism. There's not an ounce of this sort of traditional zealotry of the revolution. These are people who want power for themselves, and for their families. Like other sort of corrupt elites in different parts of the world, they have, if there is a worldview, they have a worldview of sort of Iranian issues. And on Israel, let me just say something important that is often totally gets missed in the press. A two-state solution is not the official position of the Iranian Reformist Front. We're not talking some revolutionary group that is sort of repressed in Iran. This is the party of the Iranian president, right? The party of the Iranian president has the two-state solution as its official slogan. Zarif, who is Khamenei's confidant, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs 6 months ago in which he basically said if Palestinians accept a two-state solution, he doesn't use the word two-state solution, he said if Palestinians accept the solution, we'll have to accept it. Iran has, of course, voted for two-state solution and stuff before. And, of course, it's Zarif himself who also said, not a million years ago, but a year ago, that Iranians are tired of being more Palestinian than Palestinians, right? So even on a big taboo issue like Israel, a two-state solution that is taboo in some U.S. campuses is actually the official position of the reformist camp in Iran. So there is this more ideological diversity in this regime than is acknowledged in this sort of image. And Khamenei's life has been a failure. The future will not be written by people like the future of Iran will not be a Khameneist Iran.
There's several points made here, and Negar, please stop me for going along with it. This is actually a fascinating back and forth. One is the future of
please
Iran.
go ahead.
One is the future of Iran. My commentary about reading that press is not about determining or reading the tea leaves of the future of Iran. There's a lot more better sourcing. That is about understanding the problem of the present. Political science is looking for theories of change, but we have to understand also stasis. How did the Islamic Republic, a regime that is as morally and economically and politically bankrupt, get to stay in power so long if the most powerful person is an absolute moron? I think there's a difference between saying Khamenei is a coward and saying Khamenei is an ultimate failure. And it also depends on towards what end are we doing. First and foremost, this is someone in the business of self-preservation and regime preservation. And up until you got to 2024, up until you got to April 2024, I would even say, which was the overt direct attack by the Iranians against Israel, then the Israeli military response, and then that began the whole cycle of escalation we saw later on in 2024. Up until then, I would say 1989 to 2024, if Khamenei died tomorrow, hypothetically, his legacy would not be whoever is the next supreme leader or his son or the next generation in Iran or whatnot. Khamenei's legacy would be that he was a B-level cleric, brought in as Iran's most powerful person, outlived by outmaneuvering and killing all of his political rivals, or exiling them, or driving them abroad, or rendering them irrelevant, Rafsanjani included late in his life, and being able to compete against Israel and America and retain the regime's hard line in terms of the most important foreign policy orientations, retain the regime's anti-Israel philosophy and foreign policy, and retain the regime's anti-American philosophy and foreign policy without ever paying the cost of a direct military confrontation. His legacy would not be the nuclear issue. His legacy would be, I kept us on the course that Khomeini chartered without ever having to pay the cost for it in real military terms that the Iran-Iraq War colored the Khomeini decade in. That is his legacy. And that is now slowly beginning to change with an issue that all of us as Iranian North Americans, I'll say now with Negar included, not American, but also Arash
Also Canadian.
Yes, he's originally Canadian. Yes, my mistake, Canadian. I'm the minority, the Iranian American. Iranian North Americans have to take seriously as we are both caring about our head and our heart, which is the increased salience of the military option, which torpedoes that Khamenei legacy. That the area he miscalculated in too far was the security issue. No doubt at all that there are the likes of Ghalibaf, who calls himself a Hezbollahi Reza Khan. There's no doubt at all that is what's coming down the pike. There's no doubt at all that is not reflected in Kayhan or Vatan Imruz or Farhikhtegan or whatever. But I am trying to explain the stasis before we have the debate about the change. And we have to have the facts right about the stasis before we project the various narratives and have our legitimate debates about the forces of change.
Right.
It's a fascinating discussion, and it's also very important because understanding the worldviews of Iran will help us to understand how they will approach the United States and where this is all headed as well. So, Jay, my next question is to you. What's going to happen next, given what Arash and Behnam were just discussing in terms of how they view the United States and Israel and their worldviews and the differences there, and also what you're hearing from Trump officials. Are we going towards negotiations, or is it going to be military action?
I mean, my gut is telling me that we're going to get sucked into a diplomatic tract again. I think it's just Trump's made these really hawkish terms, but just the overall discourse.
And sorry to interrupt, is that what the Trump officials who have briefed you are saying as well? Like, what are they telling you?
I mean, I think people inside are a little wary, but I think the general consensus is that Trump and that kind of restraining element of the party or the isolationist wing are kind of more in control. And in 2 months from now, they're not going to be, the general consensus, they're not going to be ready to pull a trigger on a military strike on Iran. Maybe they'll back an Israeli one, but I think that the overall consensus is that we're probably headed back to some sort of diplomatic track just because if you just look at the power dynamics at this in this administration, of course, it's ultimately up to Trump, and he's extremely unpredictable. But he seems to have given just so much of his foreign policy to Steve Witkoff. I don't even think it's really close right now. If you ask someone who's got the most power or most influence over Trump's foreign policy, it would be Witkoff. And from what
And I
I'm
have to
hearing,
ask you, why Witkoff? How did he get this position? Isn't his background in real estate? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Like how this even happened?
Witkoff was Trump's real estate lawyer, and then kind of became his own real estate broker. But he is the ultimate sycophant. I mean, in his interviews, even with Tucker a couple of weeks ago, he said, "I wanted to be Donald Trump." I mean, it's the closeness. They're golfing buddies, business buddies, but also the sycophancy. I think this plays very well for Trump. He totally trusts Witkoff, and Witkoff's, he's got really strong ties to the government of Qatar through his past businesses. I think they're extremely and very publicly against any type of military action against Iran. I'm sure they're whispering in his ear, this thing needs to be negotiated. We can come up to some, we can find something. So I just look at who the power players are. I look at Witkoff's position. I look at these kind of Trump whisperers like Tucker, kind of very publicly campaigning against military action. My gut tells me there'll be some sort of diplomacy. Whether it doesn't pan out, that's a different question. But if you're asking me where are we in a few months, that's where I'd place my bet.
And my final question is, do you guys agree with what Gabriel Noronha was saying at the start of the podcast, that this is not actually negotiations, this is just talks, kind of a last-minute effort, and that if a deal is negotiated, that it would be a lot tougher than the JCPOA? Arash, we'll start with you, Behnam, and we'll end on Jay.
No, I think it depends what we mean by tougher. But I think yes, I think it would be a deal that would seriously restrict Iranian nuclear program. I think the difficulty has always been, and those of us in this sort of field, like we've had like a million conversations like this in the last year. I'm talking with people who are former administration officials in both Trump and Obama and Biden, right? People really who have experience with this. I think the issue has always been sort of staffing and patience on President Trump's side, right? Like, who are the people who will get into this? Who's the Steve Moniz of this talks? This was the energy secretary under Obama who, really was a nuclear scientist himself almost, right? He was a nuclear scientist past, but he was a scientist, a PhD from MIT. He knew all these details. The question is, how are they going to get into all these details? But I think President Trump would want something that he can show to Israelis and others and say, look, I have an achievement. I think he's a smart man. Like, I don't think he's silly, right? So I think he's not going to be fooled very easily by something that the regime would do, and it wouldn't be a full deal, right? So I think it would be, it wouldn't have to be a very extensive restriction on Iranian nuclear program. So I think that's that's the sort of deal we're going to see. And yes, the talks on Saturday are just the beginning. The real talks will have to, will probably take some time. But my money is on a deal in the next 2 years. Let's say that there would be in the next 1 year, 2 year, there would be some sort of a deal. And let me just add one last thing. I also think people in Iran are not sort of morons in this establishment. They're smart, and if there are any smart, yes, Trump is very willing. Yes, this is all true about JD Vance and them, and it's all true that they want to avoid a regional conflict. It's not just Qatar, by the way. Saudi Arabia, all the other Arab countries, none of them want a broader conflict, right? This is not what they want. This is not what they want at all. But at the same time, President Trump is someone who would order that military attack perhaps much easier than a lot of other his predecessors. So if Iranians are smart enough, they will also take that seriously enough. And I certainly hope that's the case to sort of avoid a strike. And I think they'll understand that. So, it's not like they're going to be in this talks and be like, these guys really want a deal so we can play them. I think they understand. And I think from the moment Trump's return became a serious possibility in last year, I think from the night when President Biden had that disastrous debate, the mood in Tehran changed. They immediately understood that if they play tough with Trump, they're going to get attacked. So I think they're very afraid of Trump in that way. And I think this is sort of will be a good motivator for them to give enough concessions to to give a deal that President Trump could sell to his base and other parts of the administration.
I would say really quickly, I think I forgot to address the other point about Israel and the reformist elements in Iran that Arash mentioned, which is that may be nice, but that may be too little too late, because that party which doesn't control Iran's foreign policy has still been at the helm when Iran's foreign policy has helped to essentially eradicate a two-state solution from being a practicality anytime in the short term. And not saying there aren't any others as well here who have helped to make this issue more gray than black and white, but the material support and the political support they've given to entities like Hamas and Hezbollah, but particularly Hamas, and now the potential for even the West Bank front to be radicalized, the Islamic Republic still takes ownership of that. So it might be nice to see some ascendant statements and a very minority element of the Iranian political elite, but again, because it hasn't manifested itself in terms of Iranian policy, and because Iranian policy has been so destructively anti-Semitic and anti-Israel, I wouldn't put that as a plus. I would still put that in the minus column. But it is important, again, to note diversity. But we have to look for where there is breadth, but also where there is depth when Iran is like spending its assets. And also using that to transition to the nuclear comment now, I think certainly the regime is keen to offer as little as possible. I think unlike 2013 to 2015, this is not necessarily about economics, even though they are in a much worse economic position. And this is not necessarily about what Team Rouhani was really offering, not just the world, but America, about Iran potentially being a responsible nuclear stakeholder. That was really a lot of what the way the Rouhani administration was branding its nuclear program. This is a much more securitized endeavor. This is about blunting maximum pressure and using negotiations as a human shield to prevent a preemptive Israeli military option and to decolor and then ultimately discount a potential American military option, such that the Iranians could limp along for the rest of Max Pressure 2.0, just like they did for 1.0, and ultimately still be able to vindicate Khamenei's top goal, which is to still be in power when Trump is no longer in power. So that is how I see the approach to the negotiations today. It's much more of a limited aims, and towards those limited aims, I do fear, like Jay does, that they could offer the Trump administration something which in DC we say good enough for government work, which might be good enough for government work that might modify some of the things that Trump himself may have tried to modify way back in 2018. But the problem is the nuclear program of 2018 is not the nuclear program of 2025. The reason FDD has been leading the charge to move from arms control to disarmament or dismantlement is because of that massive growth in capability that exists on the ground and that change in risk tolerance of Iran's leaders who are still at the helm today, necessitating a much larger approach. So, I don't personally condone diplomacy at the moment, but again, if you have to do it, there's really only one diplomatic option on the table, which is wholesale disarmament. And I think this meeting in Oman is very important because it'll be as much a test about paradigms than anything else. Because the paradigm set by what Jay helped expose back in 2012, 2013, about the talks that led to the JPOA in Geneva, which was that Oman back channel in 2012 with Jake Sullivan and whatnot, was really the collapse of the U.S. position. That was the prime mover, that collapse in the position of from can Iran have enrichment to how much enrichment can Iran actually have, that change in the line of questioning. And so if there is a meeting or talks or indirect talks or something that is indirect that becomes later on direct, whatever format, if it ultimately ends up begetting this collapse in the U.S. position, and I say wholeheartedly that I do hope the Waltz position is the entire position, although obviously there is everything that Witkoff has said on the Tucker interview as well. Nonetheless, if it ends up having given the Iranians the impression that America will change and have its position bled out over time, then the paradigm that Arakchi and his team offers will be very critical to study. And I fear that it could be slightly better or slightly worse than the JCPOA. And the political win that the Iranians would take away from that would be that they forced the person who left that baseline of slightly better, slightly worse in 2018 back into something like that. And that's something, as someone who does want really the best for maximum pressure, would be ringing the alarm bell about, saying you should be keen to avoid.
And Jay, we'd like to close with you on that.
I think he's right. The framework was key, and we didn't even know back in 2013, 2014 initially that the big issue was enrichment. Were we going to accept enrichment? And it was true even before John Kerry became Secretary of State, that when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, her people kind of greenlit that enrichment would be accepted, and then the things were off and running. I do think pretty early, whatever the framework of negotiations might be, we should start hearing it, whether it's in Oman this week. I mean, this stuff's been negotiated 6 ways till Sunday. It's not like they're they're not remaking a car or anything. It's there's a lot to draw on. It's just a question: is the U.S. are we gonna stick to dismantlement? Are we gonna stick to the Libya model? If we really are, then those meetings in Oman might be pretty short. But if they can kind of push the United States back into this framework of not dismantlement, essentially modifying the nuclear program, then there might be a deal, but it could be very, very similar to the last one.
Well, thank you so much to everyone, and to Gabriel, who had to leave earlier. Thank you to our panel, and for joining us on Eye for Iran today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked this episode, hit the like button. Leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you think. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.